the price of batteries has come down so much that lithium-ion is now sort of a viable option to produce technologies, to produce durations at these levels. The technological innovation that's happening there as well within the lithium-ion space, 2 years ago wasn't even sort of possible, and now we're talking about durations for potentially sort of 24 hours, which is really exciting.
I'm sure you've seen it or heard it before. What's going to happen to the electricity network when the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine? Well, it doesn't need to mean lights out if long-duration energy storage has anything to do with it. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Smartery podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Gifford. If you're watching the video version, for better or for worse, this week I'm appearing in higher resolution, so don't adjust your screen. It's just a hardware upgrade on our end. And we have another double header on the podcast today. A little later, I'll be joined by Cruz, a policy officer with Energy Storage Europe, to discuss a new paper the Industry Association has published, assessing the long-duration energy storage landscape in Europe and suggesting measures that can be effective in getting more long-duration flexibility into the European energy system. I'm also speaking with Pete Tillotson, a senior research analyst with Benchmark Mineral Intelligence, formerly known as RoMotion. Pete takes us through some of the renewable energy baseload projects that are currently under development and what's making them work on a technology, geographic, and financial basis. But before that, a quick word from us here at the Smartery podcast. If you're listening or watching the pod for the first time, please do subscribe, follow, and leave a rating or review. At the Smartery pod, we're really trying to bring together the latest info and expert opinions about the solar energy industry, technology, batteries, and the energy transition to as large an audience as possible. And if you're sick of hearing these old tropes about the intermittency of renewables and how batteries really aren't ready, then be sure to spread the word. And you can get in touch with us anytime at podcast@thesmartery.com. Lithium-ion batteries are going big, but they're also going long, or longer at least. And that's what we want to explore in this conversation on the Smartery podcast. Pete Tillotson is a senior research analyst with RoMotion, now Benchmark Mineral Intelligence. Pete, thanks for joining the pod.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Now, I said batteries are going big and also going long. We've seen some kind of landmark projects kind of getting off the ground, particularly in sunny parts of the world. Let's talk through some of them. Now, the headline's been kind of solar and battery baseload from some of the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC region. What's kind of behind this development for these longer duration lithium-ion batteries?
Yeah, so, taking battery duration as sort of like a concept, we're really seeing those durations extend past what currently is sort of the norm, which is sort of 1 to 2 hours, extending up to 4 hours. And that means essentially how long a battery can discharge at its full power for. So if you've got a 5 megawatt battery discharging for 1 hour, that's 5 megawatt hours. Discharging for 10 hours, that would be 50 megawatt hours. And taking that to sort of its logical conclusion, the idea is that you could then use batteries to use renewable energy as baseload, which is, essentially keeping a stable level of energy on the grid all the time from renewables, which at the moment isn't possible because of the constraints of renewable energy and its variation, and also the constraints of battery duration. So what's happening in the GCC is really interesting. It's essentially sort of one of the first large scale attempts that we've seen as renewable baseload, and there's a few things that sort of enable that to happen. Essentially, the price of batteries has come down so much that lithium-ion is now sort of a viable option to produce technologies, to produce durations at these levels. The technological innovation that's happening there as well within the lithium-ion space, 2 years ago wasn't even sort of possible, and now we're talking about durations for potentially sort of 24 hours, which is really exciting. these are sort of at the nth degree of projects that we're seeing in the pipeline at the moment. The standard consideration for sort of long duration is, between 8 and 10 hours. The fact that there isn't really sort of a standard definition is case in point for we're not really sure how to understand that concept. But for the case in particular in the sort of the Middle East region here, the logic here for deploying renewables and batteries is essentially to free up more fossil fuels for export, which is the key sort of reason for doing it there. But as an industry, we're all very excited about this sort of idea as renewables plus batteries as base loads, because that's sort of where we want to go with this renewable transition, right? That's sort of the end goal.
Absolutely. So it's not just hyperbole then, renewable baseload.
No, I think that's where we need to go as an industry, and we're seeing technological and sort of financial innovations that's enabling that to happen. How fast it takes us to get there, I don't think anyone was expecting 24-hour baseload potentially this soon. We'll see whether it sort of comes to fruition in its sort of totality. It was a pretty sort of catchy, attractive headline, but I'm confident that other projects will come about sort of trying to pursue that goal. But it's certainly exciting to see, that's certainly a target that people are targeting sort of in the near future.
Yeah, well, let's talk technology just a little bit later. But first, looking at the kind of preconditions to achieve this 24-hour renewable energy supply, a combination of solar, but perhaps some wind also, and large battery energy storage systems, really big BESS. We're talking about the GCC. This is a part of the world that has land. It has ample solar resource. It's really sunny. There's also plenty of wind and also capital, right? So do you really need this, such a generous renewable energy resource to make 24-hour renewables possible?
Well, it depends what your sort of energy demand is. It depends what your definition of sort of 24-hour renewables is. If you're supplying 24-hour renewables for the entire grid, sure, your wind and solar resources need to be huge. Your land area needs to be huge. Your efficiency needs to be huge. And as you rightly say, the capex and finances available needs to be pretty sizable. If you're using it for a specific use case, in that I think this project is likely to, rather than it's sort of a case in point, large scale pilot to say we can provide 24 hours of renewable energy. That can be sort of pretty focused and limited, but I suppose there's a reason why it's being built in these places where there is such sort of high financing available. It's also being worked in partnership with a lot of Chinese companies from the technology side and from sort of the EPC side, and another sort of huge player in Masdar as well is working on a lot of these projects. Really experienced EPC companies that are used to building these sort of large scale infrastructure projects, where potentially it might be more difficult in regions where that expertise isn't necessarily in place, or the resources just aren't necessarily available, both in terms of land and finances. So it's not particularly surprising that this type of project is happening in this part of the world.
Yeah. All right. That's a really good insight. Potentially more challenging because of the use of the energy and also the geography, right? Like I'm in Germany. It certainly hasn't been sunny the last couple of months. You're in the UK. There's not a lot of ample land that you can develop large scale renewables. So I think that's worthwhile keeping in mind. You also mentioned price for batteries. Now, without giving away too much of the Benchmark Mineral Intelligence kind of special sauce when it comes to your battery pricing models, we have seen really dramatic cost reductions, which is facilitating just this scale of battery installations, haven't we?
Absolutely. Price reductions, more than halving over the past 2 years, and sort of, continuing to do so both at the cell level and at the system level, to the point where we've seen, within China, these anti-involution measures to try and sort of raise these prices where, companies are essentially selling at a loss to try and gain market share. And that has really enabled, along with a whole host of other areas, to make energy storage really become some part of like a nice to have, or like a niche to really sort of core infrastructure in terms of energy networks. And that sort of proliferation has really made energy storage more attractive, not only from a sort of network perspective, but also from an investment perspective. You've seen a lot more finance sort of companies interested in investing in energy storage, both from the manufacturing side and from the sort of operating side as well. At the sort of regulatory political level, we're seeing more and more interest from network operators and indeed from governments trying to make business cases stronger for operating these energy storage assets on grids. And that's because, it's essentially such a bankable solution to provide flexibility. Right now, it's competing with gas, to a certain extent, other forms of flexibility like hydrogen, and obviously all the other energy storage types, sort of your mechanical, sort of your compressed airs, etc., CO2s, so like that. But the technological advancement and the cost reductions in specifically lithium-ion battery energy station storage is really what's enabled this sort of explosion over the past 2 or 3 years, and we're sort of not seeing forecasts reduce much anywhere anytime soon.
Okay, and what were some of the price measures or the kind of export measures that the Chinese government is taking? I think that's interesting. We've seen that also in solar PV over the last couple of years. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, so they've essentially reduced the export subsidy available, which debatable as to how much of that cost is going to be passed on. There was a big reduction a year or two ago, and it was thought that that would have a real big impact on battery costs, during which time we've seen the costs fall dramatically of energy storage cells and systems. So the extent to whether this is going to be passed on to end consumers in the role of sort of integrators, or indeed over the sort of the cost of the entire project, or the cost is just going to be borne by these exporters, sort of yet to be seen. We have seen battery cell costs slightly increase actually over the past few months. That's also on the back of the slight increase in lithium raw material costs. There's a certain argument to be said that these battery manufacturers working with such tight margins in some regions will see a raw material increase and sort of see how much they can get away with increasing their costs, and see sort of how far they can push the market to an acceptable level without losing market share. But this is sort of in the minutiae of battery costs. When we look at it sort of at an overall picture, the battery cost reductions are sort of unfathomable from sort of 4 or 5 years ago, both at the rate and the extent, and that's really enabled what we've been talking about, which is the huge surge in popularity and accessibility of energy storage.
Well, we were talking about these projects in the GCC region. Let's look elsewhere in the world. I was struck by a tender, I think, just a couple of weeks ago from New South Wales, so a state of Australia, populous state where Sydney is the capital, where some of the winning bids for longer duration storage projects were lithium-ion technology. Now, Australia's pretty sunny, sure. There's plenty of land, so it does meet some of these criteria of the GCC. But I think what struck me was, previously there was always a bit of a narrative that lithium-ion is good for 2, maybe 4 hours of energy storage in terms of capacity, but something like 8 or 10 really doesn't pencil out. What did you make of these New South Wales tender results?
As part of my job, I'm tracking individual projects, sort of the project by project level, globally. So I'm in a pretty unique position where I'm not very surprised by these anymore. 2 years ago, if something was 6 hours, I'd sort of raise an eyebrow, but we're seeing projects of 8, 10, 12 regularly come through, announced in the project pipeline. These projects aren't scheduled to come online until 27, 28. or sometimes even further afield. But that's where the market is going, and that's where sort of the operability levels of these energy storage assets are going. Alongside that, the capacities are also dramatically increasing. Similar sort of story. 2 or 3 years ago, if a gigawatt hour scale project, which is 1,000 megawatt hours, came through into our database, it would be a news story. Whereas now, that's pretty standard, and that's across most battery regions. It's particularly the more mature ones, such as Australia, that we're seeing now. Australia is a particularly interesting case because they're rapidly decommissioning their coal assets. So they need a quick, accessible, and bankable option to provide that flexibility. And it's all the evidence you need that it's providing these large durations. I think some even above 10 hours are being selected for lithium-ion. So that's a statement of the current state of technology available on lithium-ion BESS.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting you said bankable, right? So it's perhaps in lithium-ion's favor as a technology, energy storage technology, that it has an established track record. So it's really just scaling up what you did on 2 hours across many more of them.
Exactly. Yeah. But crucially, there needs to be operating revenue models for these longer duration assets. There's sort of standard durations in each market. California is 4 hours, UK is 2, pushing to just under 3. Australia, depending on what sort of market you're looking at, can be anywhere between 2 and, if you're part of these sort of long duration tenders, 10, 12. What enables that longer duration is, a stable revenue stream or sort of compensation mechanism. A lot of the time you won't be discharging at that level, but it will be similar to a capacity market, scheme where you'll be paid to have that capacity available, which is similar to what was done for gas assets. UK is doing a similar thing with the long duration cap and floor scheme. So we're finding ways of making these long duration assets bankable and attractive to investors, which is a really exciting thing.
Well, we'll dig into the policy from a European perspective just after this, so stick around for that in the next segment of the Smartery podcast. Now, in terms of technology, I kind of alluded to it, and you've also mentioned other forms of flexibility, right? That could be green hydrogen has been proposed. There's other kind of novel energy storage technologies, compressed air, gravity storage. I remember over the years, every now and then it kind of pops its head up. But in terms of like batteries themselves, it was often flow battery proponents. So vanadium redox flow, as an example, have always said like this longer duration is our sweet spot because we just need bigger tanks, and then we can scale this much more easily than lithium-ion ever could. Do you think? Yeah, what are the implications that these lithium-ion projects are being able to scale and are being bankable at these longer durations?
Yeah, totally. It's a now a heavily sort of competitive field. This longer duration piece, as you rightly said before, it was reserved for sort of niche long duration applications such as vanadium flow, and now lithium ion is really sort of accelerating into that space. As is the case with sort of everything across the energy transition, I do think it's a case of we need everything everywhere all at once. So there's not to say that lithium ion will take over everything. We're still seeing vanadium flow projects come through. We're still seeing sort of investment in those type of projects, and case in point with some of these sort of central procurements of long duration, technology diversity is paramount. So you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. Same with any sort of big infrastructure build out. It's good to diversify these sort of things. But certainly, when we're talking to these companies in these long duration technologies outside of lithium ion, the conversations that they're having trying to sell is, why wouldn't I go for lithium ion? And they're selling against lithium ion all the time, and increasingly so. But I'm confident, particularly how much energy storage market, how much room there is to grow, and the capacities available that will still be built in the short, medium, and long term. that there's ample room for all of these technologies. Right now, lithium-ion is having sort of a pretty dominant spell, and that's a combination of all the factors we've talked about price, about data in the field, about confidence in the technology, innovation in the technology as well. But there's still certain use cases for vanadium flow and other technologies as well that are certainly still relevant.
Well, I think benchmark mineral intelligence and row motion, I think is known to many people in the marketplace for your information in terms of the manufacturing landscape for energy storage, and it is a complex supply chain. When we look at other technologies, we've spoken a lot about lithium-ion. That is the dominant technology, having its moment in the sun, I suppose. Sodium-ion is one that we're hearing more and more about, big plans to try and scale that technology. How do you assess the prospects for sodium-ion technology?
Yeah, it's been a technology that's about to come for quite a long time now. Really, what we're talking about with technology and energy storage is safety, cost, and performance. Those are the three sort of metrics. On all three, up until sort of relatively recently, it's been considered that it's not comparative on any of them. On performance, particularly around sort of the cycle life area, how long a sodium-ion cell would last versus a specialized LFP cell in lithium-ion, it's still not quite competitive. Cost is sort of approaching competitiveness, which is why we're sort of seeing another sort of renaissance in sodium-ion. You'll notice also it correlates with the lithium price. So when lithium price spikes, there's much more interest in sodium-ion. When it drops, no one's really that interested. But the developments that are happening in the space, particularly China's sort of leading the way again here. They are being sodium-ion projects are being deployed. We had our first sort of Seoul large-scale projects come online last year. What we're seeing is sodium-ion being deployed in China alongside LFP. So what it was really good for is that short ramping period. Is sort of those high energy density applications. So if you pair 5% of your project, sometimes even less, with 95% LFP, it can be used. That's 5% for sodium-ion can be used to ramp very quickly. And essentially, what we're thinking is that's being used for sort of data collection, seeing how that performs in the field. Outside of China, we're not seeing a whole lot of interest for your sort of for want of a better phrase, bog standard energy storage project. You're going to go for the one that's most reliable, cheapest, and has the most data in the field and proven technology, which is LFP. That being said, there are specific use cases for sodium-ion. There are players outside of China that are both in Europe and the US and elsewhere that are looking to deploy this. In terms of supply chain, which is one of the big pulls to sodium-ion, there's sodium is abundant as a raw material. It would relieve a lot of that early stage supply chain risk to China. The raw material processing is still the vast majority is in China. So that's a battle for sodium-ion as a technology to win in the near future. But it's certainly on the way, and it will have a role to play in energy storage. But right now, it's not quite competitive with LFP.
And just finally, Pete, the battery supply chain is still very much dominated by the electric vehicle market. Are we seeing any changes there as these batteries get bigger, as battery storage continues to grow around the world? Or, are the car makers and the battery makers who are supplying them still really in the driver's seat?
In terms of battery demand total, it's still very much an EV-led market. Battery share of energy storage is growing. I think it doubled from 24 to 25, and I think we're expecting it to sort of stay roughly the same, around sort of 20% of total market share in global battery demand. What we're seeing more recently is sort of a relative slowdown from the perspective EV battery manufacturers versus the growth we're seeing in energy storage. So we're seeing sort of lines being converted from EV battery specific to energy storage battery specific. Having said that, the driving force is still EVs, and that sort of story is mostly region specific, particularly in the US, where we're seeing energy storage explode and EVs potentially come down, largely as a result of the current administration, which is a temporary problem, hopefully. So generally, the picture is generally staying the same. But if you think about sort of market share percentages, the total capacities of all of these industries is growing. So the story is growth everywhere, and particularly for energy storage, which has been the fastest growing battery market for the past 2 years, and will continue to be so.
Encouraging signs far and wide. Pete Tillotson, Senior Research Analyst with RowMotion, now Benchmark Mineral Intelligence. Thanks so much for joining the Smartery podcast.
Thanks very much for having me.
I'll be honest, as an Australian living in Central Europe, the long nights and grey skies of midwinter definitely take some getting used to. And I don't think I've ever really adjusted, but they also pose a very big challenge to the energy transition. Extended periods of predominantly dark skies and light winds, the so-called Dunkelflaute or dark doldrums, presents a real challenge to the energy system as we continue to scale renewables and rely more heavily on solar and wind. These kind of periods are one of the use cases for long duration energy storage, or LDES. But it's not been an easy type of technology to kind of get into the power system here in Europe. In late January, Energy Storage Europe published a policy paper looking at how more LDES can be incentivized. And I'm pleased to say one of the authors of the paper, Carolina Cruz, a policy officer with Energy Storage Europe, joins the Smartery podcast today. Carolina, thanks for joining us.
Hi, Jonathan. Thank you for the invitation.
My pleasure. Well, this report, it goes into a lot of detail about LDES and how to get more of it into the European energy system. But first of all, let's get a status update. How much LDES is there in the system in Europe at the moment?
So for LDS, I think we need to look at Europe broadly. In the 1st of December of 2025, we reached 100 gigawatts, which is huge. The biggest share of energy storage in Europe is actually pumped hydro, which is 54 gigawatts, which is considered long duration energy storage. Then you have 1 gigawatt of large scale thermal storage, which it's a smaller number comparatively speaking, but indeed it is growing a lot, especially with industry decarbonization. Then you have just a little below 1 gigawatt of compressed air and gravity-based systems. They are pilot and they are soon going to reach commercial stages.
Okay, and when you're talking about LDES, what does long duration mean? How long are we talking?
So, just for the record, there is no industry recognized definition, but for the purpose of the paper, we decided to employ a definition that most industry associations agree, which generally refers to storage that can deliver energy for over 8 hours or more. This covers multi-hour, of course, multi-day, and weekly or seasonal. Technologies that can be considered for this, as I mentioned before, are pumped hydro, compressed air and liquid air energy storage, gravity-based systems, thermal, as I mentioned, flow batteries and metal air batteries, and power to gas to power. So, for example, hydrogen.
I remember some of these battery technologies more than 10 years ago. Flow batteries were seen as a really good alternative to lithium-ion, but we've really seen lithium-ion expand at an incredibly rapid pace, and it's taken up some of the oxygen that these other battery technologies could have potentially been supported by. So what other barriers do you find, and did you find in this policy paper, to getting more LDES into the system in Europe?
Indeed, and I also like to tell people that LDES or LDES is at the same stage that batteries and solar PV were 10 years ago. So I'm quite optimistic about these technologies. However, indeed, there are barriers to this. Permitting is a big thing. I would like to give you the example of Italy. Kudos to Italy for employing a legislation that fast tracks permitting for batteries, but then this does not apply to other energy storage technologies. Fortunately, one of our members engaged with the local authorities so that they could benefit from this treatment. But indeed, you do not see the same thing happening across member states. Again, as I was saying, it was like batteries and solar PV 10 years ago, so they can be quite capex intensive. Also, some policymakers are starting to understand the added value of these technologies. So I like to look on the bright side.
Well, and by the permitting, are there unique challenges to permitting then long duration storage systems, or is it the same permitting challenges that are seen in many different parts of Europe?
They are quite horizontal across technologies and applications, but we are looking at an average of 10 years time, which is a lot these days, especially for such a fast-paced and growing industry.
So is that 10 years in particular for long duration systems because they operate differently on the grid, is that right?
It can be across different technologies, so normal, let's say, energy storage, but I can safely say that I have seen long duration energy storage technology projects that are facing these long timelines.
Sure. So there's evidence of such hugely long permitting processes, which is pretty crazy, 10 years. And it's particularly crazy because we're starting to see some of the impacts of not having long duration storage on the European electricity networks, particularly in places where there is lots of solar and wind and perhaps not as much thermal generation or other types of firm generation. So what are we seeing? How is this manifesting itself?
You're right, Jonathan. And there's a very good report about this by the Joint Research Center. For the people listening, the Joint Research Center is the technical arm of the European Commission, or that's what we like to call it. And they have, again, this beautiful report that says that the redispatch cost for Europe in 2022, okay, it was 4 years ago, but still relevant, was 5 billion euros. And if we continue with the business as usual case, we're going to reach 100 billion euros by 2040 of spending in system balancing costs. This is not pocket money. Again, we can, if we do not consider these technologies, maybe tenders will be opened for gas-fired generation. There are some countries that are still doing this, and negative or low prices, which are not very welcomed these days.
Yeah. Okay. So there's this kind of market fluctuation or variability or instability in terms of pricing, long periods of negative prices, as you've said, perhaps when there's too much solar and wind in the system, but also these power spikes as well. As I said, the Dunkelflaute, is that the kind of classic use case for long duration energy storage?
Indeed, and again, we're gonna use Germany as an example here. For the people listening, if you're not watching a video, we have used a graphic in our paper which shows Germany and the price volatility and the carbon-free share patterns. So again, for the people listening, let's use our imagination. On the left side, you see the share of carbon-free electricity hour by hour across each year. And on the right side, which is orange, you see the day-ahead electricity prices over the same hours. When you line them up, there's a clear pattern. So you look at during summer, especially around midday, the carbon-free generation is very high because of the solar penetration, luckily, and prices collapse at the same time, sometimes even turning negative, which is a big topic of conversation in the last couple of months. That tells us that there's more clean power than the system can use or shift. But then looking at the evenings and the winter period, the carbon-free generation drops sharply and prices spike. That's when the system is still relying on gas and other fossil resources to meet demand. This pattern is not unique in Germany. We see it across Europe, and it erodes the renewable profitability, increases system costs, as I was saying before, and keeps consumer exposed to volatile gas prices.
In Germany, when there are periods of abundant clean energy, there's also periods of low or negative prices. We also have curtailment in the market where we have wind energy that can't be used, solar energy on bright sunny days that can't be used. How can LDES address that?
So speaking of curtailment, if you ask someone else, they can say that curtailment is good. But for the purpose of this conversation, we're going to assume that is not. What are the obvious advantages of long duration energy storage? One thing that is very relevant these days is for industrial decarbonization. There's a good example from Portugal, from a beer factory. I think everyone knows Heineken. Now they're looking to decarbonize, and they have put a thermal plant there. And one very good thing is that after Heineken can participate in the electricity market, and they can actually make revenues out of this. So not only from selling beers, but from selling and buying energy. The lights don't go off in countries, which is very, very important. And it provides, again, this carbon-free electricity. There's the growth of data centers in Europe. This is common knowledge. And what is very positive from these data centers is that they're looking at decarbonized processes to keep energy and data running around the clock. So for me, that would be the greatest value of these technologies.
Yeah, so it's quite interesting that you can have actually distributed long duration energy storage. I think when you think about it superficially or just initially, you can think long duration energy storage requires very big systems, kind of like pumped hydro style projects. But with those two examples you've given, you can have them even behind the meter or alongside industrial sites.
Indeed. Other examples that I saw quite recently, there's this Bloomberg report that came out a couple of weeks ago that is also saying that compressed air is re-emerging as a very strong option for 24 hours to multi-day resilience. So when you have this Dunkelflaute, compressed air can come into the picture and help stabilize the system.
And a few months ago, we had Frank Halkwitz, a China expert, on the Smarter E podcast, and he talked about a really very big compressed air project in China. Of course, China always does huge scale, so they're talking hundreds of megawatts, which is quite impressive. Now, when we were talking about curtailment, you said that some people would say that curtailment isn't necessarily a bad thing. Is that because there's a kind of balancing act? Because some long duration storage can be, it's quite a nascent technology, can be expensive to deploy. And so in some cases, it might be just more cost efficient to curtail some of the renewable energy production than invest capturing it all with this capital intensive LDES system.
Indeed, sometimes, and to use an image, I have an image in my mind that it's almost like a scissors. You're cutting the energy instead of going into the negative prices. So, indeed, it's a win. But of course, you don't want to incur these losses.
And what's the message then for policymakers, right? You've clearly said that there's a lot of systemic cost through the lack of LDES at the moment. There's also implications for renewable energy deployment, as we've discussed. What's the message for European policymakers in this paper that you've produced?
So, for the policymakers listening to this podcast, a main recommendation that we use in this policy paper is to go towards modeling. So modeling is happening these days for the European resource adequacy assessments, but they are not modeling multi-hour, multi-day energy needs. So batteries are more being considered here than other technologies. Another recommendation that we make is to reform markets so that long duration services are bankable. We are not asking policymakers to reform completely the electricity market design, but we do have to adapt to the technologies that are emerging in the market. Again, as we discussed before, grid charges and taxation are penalizing storage. There's this double taxation happening when you put energy inside and when you discharge these devices. And also permitting needs to be fast-tracked. Kudos to the grids package that came out a couple of months ago, in which permitting will be fast-tracked by 6 months and up to 2 years for pump hydro, if I'm not mistaken. So we just have to see member states implementing this.
And you mentioned technology landscape, and we did touch on lithium-ion a little bit. It really, there's a huge amount of momentum behind lithium-ion technology because of its deployment in the mobility space, because of EVs and electric buses and trucks. There's also been progress made with sodium-ion batteries, so salt batteries, which is even more abundant. When you were looking at the different types of technology, did you get a sense, or did you encounter people who argued, look, lithium-ion technology, or maybe sodium-ion technology, is just going to scale to these long durations that are required by the grid, that you can just, these battery systems can get bigger and bigger, not just day-night, but even multi-day?
Indeed, and you already see their role in markets these days. Some batteries are being deployed up to 6 to 8 hours in Europe. And for example, if you look at Saudi Arabia, it's very far away and much more sunnier than here, but they are going even towards longer durations. But indeed, they would never do, for example, these multi-day capabilities that these longer duration are doing.
Yeah, and that tends to be kind of in very sunny places where they can cover the day-night with a lithium-ion battery. Thank you very much, Carolina Cruz from the Energy Storage Association, for sharing those findings about long-duration energy storage. I feel like it is one of the subjects that we know we need to address as an industry and as a society and as Europe, but it is really not in the forefront of many people's thinkings. How would you respond to that?
Well, let's look at the States, right? They are years ahead of us in terms of deploying these technologies. For example, let's look at HydroStore. They do compressed air in salt caverns, and this was envisioned 25 years ago. Okay, it came to life quite recently, but it is bankable. It exists out there. Look at California as well. And even some colleagues here from the association side, they're claiming that Italy is going to be the new California. So let's just wait and see. And I think we're in a good pace right now. Exciting times.
Carolina Cruz, a policy officer with Energy Storage Europe. Thanks so much for sharing some of those encouraging signs, some of those challenges as well to getting long duration energy storage into the system.
Thank you very much.
This podcast is a Climate Copy production. Nicole Schäfer is our graphic designer, Ina Gossen, Wolfgang Weicht and Peggy Herter-Zille are the marketing team. And Matthew Denis is on the edit. Be sure to follow, like and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts or wherever you've found us. Get in touch with feedback, comments or suggestions at podcast@thesmartery.com. The Smartery takes place in Munich on June 22nd to 25th this year and includes a special exhibition on 24/7 renewables, which will definitely involve long-duration storage technologies and projects. So I hope to see you there. I'm Jonathan Gifford, and thanks for joining me on the Smartery podcast.